In this lecture, we're going to talk a bit about the way the United States of America came to being, the founding of the United States of America, doing a very general survey, primarily of the political elements and trends that came together. This is not a class on the history of the American Revolution. Dr. Jonathan Foster and Dr. Ethan Hawkley offer such classes. You should take those classes if you want to learn more. Instead, we're going to try to understand how the who gets what, when, and where, and how questions were central to the start of the American Revolution and the creation of the United States of America, and how that could have also had long-term impact. Because how a country is founded might have a very big impact on its later history. For example, political scientists have found multiple indicators in studies that countries that were born in violent conflict tend to be conflict-prone once independent. More importantly, the narratives of the founding of a state can have a big impact on the rules, especially the rules of the who. Greece was founded in a violent revolution in which us versus them was determined by religious and ethnic characteristics. Christian Orthodox, Greek versus Muslim. It was unimportant if the Muslim was actually a Greek, speaking Greek, whose great-great-parents might have been Greek Orthodox, who then became Muslim. From the moment that you were a Muslim, you were the other. And historically, Greece has a very hard time accepting Muslims as equal citizens. And also that is one of the reasons why there's such a focus on Greek national identity as an element of citizenship. The US, on the other hand, was also founded on a violent revolution, but the us versus them was determined by ideological characteristics mainly. I mean, there were a couple of ethnic elements, Scots versus English and so on, but mainly it was ideological characteristics, Tories versus Whigs, Patriots versus Tories. And maybe this also explains the different politics of the two states towards immigration, the fact that America is much more open to immigration. Of course, both countries have a very military history with multiple wars with their neighbors and with even countries as far away as possible from them as can be possible. To begin understanding how the US came to existence and how that impacted the way things are done in politics here, we need to answer a simple question. Who was it that became unhappy with how they got what in the old system? You know, why are we not subjects of the British Queen nowadays? Because of who, what, how. Someone was unsatisfied with the how over what. Someone was unsatisfied with how the British political system was distributing scarce resources. Let's go into it. Let's start with the who. And the founding of the colonies in North America has become controversial enough that even cartoons poke fun. But the point still remains that for many reasons, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people left the English Isles, mainly England and Scotland, a bit less Wales as well, much more later. The Irish immigration comes much more later on, to seek life in America. There were also, of course, German immigrants and immigrants from other parts of Western Europe, but the majority were essentially English and Scots.
I declare this land Quahog.
This place is nothing but a wilderness. What are we gonna do?
We're gonna build a new settlement. We'll have a happy new life and we'll have equal rights for all. Except blacks, Asians, Hispanics, Jews, gays, women, Muslims, everybody who's not a white man. And I mean white, so no Italians, no Polish, just people from Ireland, England, and Scotland. But only certain parts of Scotland and Ireland. Just full-blooded whites. No, you know what? Not even whites. Nobody gets any rights. America.
Now, one of the biggest reasons that they left the English Isles was religious problems. This was the case especially before the victory of Parliament in the English Civil War that lasted from 1644 to 1648, when people who belonged to minority radical Protestant denominations, who we call Puritans and Pilgrims today, fled the power of the established Anglican Church in England and the Presbyterian Calvinist, essentially Scottish Kirk in Scotland. Other people left during the dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell in order to avoid Puritan authoritarianism. Many Anglicans left then, as well members belonging to smaller, even more radical denominations like Anabaptists that even the Puritans could not tolerate. With the restoration of the king in 1660 and the restoration of the Anglican Church to its dominant power, the Presbyterians in Scotland always kept their power despite losing wars and everything. This exodus of dissidents continued. Finally, you had many English Catholics, especially, who came to the United States, to the colonies that will become the United States, fleeing the persecution of Catholicism in the English Isles by both various kings and parliaments. So for a lot of people, the issue was coming here to live a life according to their religious creed. And most of these belong to the more radical examples of Protestantism, especially Calvinism, Baptism, and so on, which is why there is this underlying, I always like to call it Calvinist trend in American rhetoric, in American politics. Even if you're an atheist, people behave and speak in their politics as if they were essentially preachers. And that is partly because most of the people who came to America, especially before it became independent, came because they were religiously motivated to live a life according to the rules that they believed were divine. But of course, there were also those that were not coming to America seeking paradise on earth or the divine life, but more base and pragmatic economic opportunity. The Industrial Revolution was well underway in Britain in the 17th and the 18th century. The destruction of the feudal property system and essentially the feudal corporate rights that serfs enjoyed, the right, for example, to till the common land, left hundreds of thousands of people without any livelihood or any ability to keep themselves alive. Many flocked to the great English cities that essentially grew huge and out of proportion of their initial establishment, seeking work in the new factories. But living conditions were squalid because it was not considered back then a public good to have adequate housing or sewage and so on, and pay was very little. Now, the new economy did offer opportunities in England and Scotland, but a lot of those were just grabbed by the already rich aristocracy who simply became even more powerful and entrenched. For many people in the English Isles who pined for a rural life, the extent of land in the Americas that was not cultivated by anyone seemed like the chance to live the dream of the life of a country squire, essentially a self-sufficient rural landowner who essentially survives by the work of a couple of tenants or slaves. Now, the problem is, of course, that a lot of that land was in use by the indigenous Americans. They might not have cultivated it in the way that Europeans understood, but they were using it. And those indigenous Americans will be tricked or killed out of it. So there was this huge land grab. Now, not all of the land, by the way. The American tribes were not everywhere, but a lot of it, especially the one that the arriving colonists really wanted to get in order to impose European-style high-yield agriculture. And while many came here, as we said, seeking God, and others came here seeking the life of a country squire, there were also people who came here seeking a virtuous politics, a virtuous state within the earth. The United Kingdom was not an absolute monarchy like France or Russia during the 18th century. But many people felt that the British system of government was unfair, corrupt, and stifling. Elections were done by an extremely small percentage of the population. The voting process was very corrupt, something alluded to by the Blackadder skit that is integrated in this PowerPoint, and you're probably going to watch after you hear me. And politics was dominated by the rich and the aristocracy. For many people, especially educated people who were thinking in the Enlightenment logic, this corruption permeated British life totally, and they believed that they could create a more virtuous politics in the Each colony had a different way of answering the who, what, and how of the politics question. Remember, how also includes the which, includes the where and when. New York and Maryland, for example, had a powerful central executive, while Pennsylvania and Georgia had more representative institutions. However, some commonalities existed that made the colonies as a group very different from the United Kingdom. all colonies had representative institutions that either advised or checked the executives. These representative institutions were made up of people elected by elections that were considered a bit less corrupt than British ones. The electorate was limited to people who either had property or paid taxes, due to the belief that the poor and destitute would always vote in their own self-interest rather than the public interest. Interestingly, this meant that initially women and free African Americans who were property owners could vote in some states. Indeed, before 1770, only 3 of 13 states denied the vote officially, none from the start. Unlike Britain, the electorate in the colonies was larger due to the expanded opportunities to get land. For example, the electorate in the UK in 1780 was just 3% of the population. That pretty much was close to the amount of people who actually owned property. In Virginia alone, instead, the number was probably closer to 30–50%. That said, the franchise changed many times within a decade since 1770. Religious prohibitions were raised or imposed. Slavery led to institutionalized racial prejudice, what we call racism, and the exclusion of free African Americans, while women were also excluded. Most representatives were people of the educated class. They were lawyers and landowners. The colonial elites were not the aristocrats of the United Kingdom, but they tended to be richer, more educated, and more conservative in their view of property rights than the larger population. These differences between the British political system and the colonial political system did create some friction. But it didn't come to a head until Britain was engaged in one of the largest wars in Western European history to that point, the 7 Years' War. And a good introduction can be provided to you from the Barry Lyndon movie. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War as well, it's known in Europe as the Third Silesian War, that lasted from 1755 to 1763, was a global struggle, as shown in the map on the PowerPoint, pitting two large coalitions, Britain and its allies, depicted in blue, and France and its allies, depicted in green. Britain won the war and thus domination in North America, but the war costed financially a huge amount of money. For the American colonists, the war was a boon. Indigenous American tribes were broken, and Franco-Spanish resistance to their colonial expansion ended. The colonists did pay a blood price, since most of the British forces fighting in North America were raised in the colonies. However, they also seemed to gain the most, especially financially. The British government, essentially Westminster Parliament, thought that the colonies had not paid their fair share for the war. This led Parliament to increasingly impose taxes on the colonies in order to make up for its financial loss from the war. The colonies resisted, claiming that such taxes were not legal due to the lack of just representation. Parliament counter-offered by telling them that it would accept them voting some members of Parliament in Westminster. But the colonies refused to be represented in the British Parliament according to British rules, because they feared they would end up like Scotland, which would always be outvoted. Instead, they were demanding a colonial assembly that would hold the kind of power Westminster Parliament had in England, Scotland, and Wales, or the Protestant-dominated Irish Parliament had in Ireland. Now, this was unacceptable to Westminster, that considered itself superior to the colonial parliaments. I mean, the Irish Parliament was one thing, but the creation of a new independent parliament was unacceptable to them. The clashes between the British Crown and Parliament in these cases were further inflamed by deep differences of ideology. People in the colonies were coming to disagree with good old English values about government. They came to believe that representatives ought to reflect the will of their constituents, the people who voted for them, rather than decide for themselves what is the public good, which was the unwritten rule in Britain. They came to believe that Parliament should not have unlimited authority, but that written law should place limits to that power. And finally, they came to believe that the people should be the ultimate authority and not a parliament of minority interests. Radical groups like the Sons of Liberty began agitating for independence, engaging in criminal acts and flouting royal authority. For example, the scene from HBO's John Adams shows them tarring and feathering a crown official. Once you see that scene, place yourself in the foot or the shoes of the British sailors that saw this scene, okay? They'll go back to Britain with their ships and they'll go to their tavern and they will tell their mates in the pub, not the bar, the pub, these are British, like, man, those colonists, they are feral, they are very angry, they don't respect anything, they're violent. From the pubs, these will go to the coffee clubs and coffee houses that were the rage in Britain that era, and to people who actually get to vote. And they will say, like, look at those colonists, how they dare rebel against us, how they dare, you know, violate the right of life and the sanctity of the person of people who are just doing their royal job for the king. From there, we'll go to Parliament, where stronger voices like Mr. Fox will yell like, the people in the colonies show no respect to law and order. They are challenging the authority of His Majesty the King of his Parliament here in Westminster, and that they must be taught a lesson. And that lesson can only be taught by imposing rule on them. British Crown had a recent example of how to pacify rebellious area, as they had pacified the Scottish Highlands by military force after their victory at the Battle of Culloden during the War of Austrian Succession.
Must play a new tax.
Subject to arrest.
You will not land this cargo, gentlemen.
This is legitimate cargo. Tea from the East India Company that you are bound by law to unload.
What's legitimate about it, friend? No other tea is allowed in Boston Harbor. Either we drink the King's foul brew or nothing at all.
And who may you be, sir?
John Hancock, ship owner.
Not John Hancock, smuggler?
Watch your words, sir. I'm an honest man being strangled by monopoly.
Shame on you, sir!
Shame on you! Shame on you! Teach him a lesson! Tar the bastard!
A brutal and illegal act to enforce a political principle, Sam! Answer me that, can you?
terrified of acts of colonial insubordination and taking their model, the suppression of the Highlander Scottish insurrection, the British Parliament accused the colonies of ingratitude and decisions to impose the law on the unruly colonies. The military presence of the United Kingdom increased, further inflaming colonial views that the government at London was becoming authoritarian. People were especially disliking the fact that they had to host British soldiers within their houses. In this era, the only government in the world that was actually seriously working on building barracks to house its soldiers was the French government, and then a bit the Russian government and the Prussian government. The British, with their attitudes towards public financing that were quite libertarian in many ways, had not. Instead, they imposed on the colonial subjects to essentially house the British soldiers. And if you watch Turn Washington Spies, you can see characteristic in the first episode this element. As a result, people were becoming in the colonies extremely resentful of this, and America, the North American colonies, became a gunpowder barrel waiting to explode. At some point, some act would blow everything up, and that was the shot that was heard around the world, the battles of Lexington and Concord. And thus, the American War of Independence, or the American Revolution, erupted. Now, the fact that blood had been shed in anger did not lead immediately to a unanimous call for revolution. As the scene from the series John Adams that I have incorporated in this PowerPoint shows, not all of the colonial elites believed in a violent break from the United Kingdom. This necessitated a need for those that believed the necessity of a break to justify a revolution in the public sphere. They had to essentially justify what they were doing, and they had to justify it to two audiences. One audience was the everyday colonial population that will have to sacrifice their money and their blood and for the revolution, and the other one will be the elites, the colonial elites, and of course also British elites and foreign elites.
I remind Mr. Rutledge and Mr. Duane that blood has been shed. Massachusetts blood. While we debate, our militia is left without munitions, without arms, without even the slightest encouragement.
Dickinson of Pennsylvania.
One colony cannot be allowed to take its sister colonies headlong into the maelstrom of war. Parliament will be eager to call a halt to hostilities, as are we. They will seek conciliation. We must offer them an olive branch. I move this assembly consider a humble and dutiful petition be dispatched to His Majesty, one that includes a plain statement that the colony desires immediate negotiation and accommodation of these unhappy disputes, and that we are willing to enter into measures to achieve that reconciliation. Second.
Mr. Dickinson.
The time for negotiation is past. The actions of the British Army at Lexington and Concord speak plainly enough. If we wish to regain our natural-born rights as Englishmen, then we must fight for them.
I have looked for our rights in the laws of nature and can find them only in the laws of political society. I have looked for our rights in the Constitution of the English government and found them there.
When it came to persuading everyday people in the colonies to join the colonial elites that wanted insurrection, the biggest job was done by Thomas Paine with his book, The Common Sense. Okay, Common Sense. The book laid out a radical vision for the future of America that persuaded the common people to back the colonial elites over the faraway Parliament in Britain. Now consider this. For the average or poor American colonist, the colonial elites were the competitors for the what of politics. They were the people who owned most of the land and most of the money. but they also were competitors with the aristocrats that ruled Parliament for Britain. They literally, either they or their forefathers, father or grandparents, left Britain escaping from there. So essentially, everyday Americans decided to side with their local elites and trust their vision of a future country, then accept the system of government offered by the more hidebound hereditary aristocracy that ruled England. So Thomas Paine's common sense became an instant hit. The soldiers of Washington's army read it in their camps, and it was what persuaded people to rebel. Now, the interesting thing is Paine, when it comes to property issues, was a very radical, if then leftist person, especially later in his life. So it's very interesting to see many libertarians, use common sense as an example of a libertarian tract, when the writer of this tract was actually somebody who advocated state support for people and redistribution of land. And much more in the future. Here he was a bit more tame, mostly focusing on questions of liberty, democracy, and self-rule. But as we said, the rebel leadership needed to also sell the revolution to their fellow colonialists that were hesitant, possible British supporters, and a wider international system. And there they couldn't sell the kind of radical political democratic vision that Paine sold in Common Sense. They had to be more diplomatic. That role was played by the Declaration of Independence, which was written mainly by Thomas Jefferson, an erudite, semi-aristocratic, high-level member of the American elite. And it laid out the justifications for which the colonists had the right to break from the British Crown. You are going to have to read the Declaration of Independence for the class. But the important thing for you to understand is that pretty much Jefferson chose to make a Lockean argument about social contract, that the British Crown violated the social contract. And, think about what were those justifications and how they led forth. But what is important to understand is that the Declaration of Independence is a very conservative document in the sense that it essentially says rebellion is the worst thing in the world and should only be attempted when all other attempts at reconciliation have failed and when the violations by the prince, in this case King George, are so egregious that it leaves no other case. And this was done on purpose in order to reassure key monarchical allies, the King of Spain and the King of France, that the American Revolution was not a radical attempt to overthrow monarchy in principle. It was just aimed at a specific monarchy with very specific conditions. And when it came to talking with the British elites, especially parliamentarians and friendly parliamentarians, Thomas Jefferson did a little trick. He presents King George as the central bogeyman. But if you know anything about British politics in this era, the king was really secondary. It was Parliament that was controlling policy. It was Parliament that actually enacted policy. But see, the point is, Thomas Jefferson was trying to persuade parliamentarians in Britain to support the American bid for independence. He couldn't do that if he accused them of being the enemy. So he used King George as the scapegoat. In the end, the Declaration of Independence was successful. France and Spain supported and then joined the War of American Independence thanks to French and Spanish support. The United States of America, the Continental Congress, was able to win the war and force England to recognize its independence. But then the hard part starts. You see, breaking from the British Crown is one thing. Creating a new state is a totally other thing. And the colonies had to create a new government that will help them organize the fight against the United Kingdom during the war and organize their political life after the war is over. After much deliberation, the choice was for forming a very loose confederation of sovereign states, each colony essentially becoming in a way an independent state and associated with each other in a very loose way. The rules binding the states together and guiding the central government, which was pretty much Congress, that was the only institution of the central government, were called the Articles of Confederation. This is the country's, the United States of America's, first constitution. And as we're going to see, it largely failed. The Articles of Confederation in many ways were very conservative, trying to maintain as much as possible the previous system of colonial government. The colonies, now states, remained sovereign, and the central government, such as it was greatly limited in what it could do. It was pretty much powerless. Indeed, Congress under the Articles of Confederation was probably less powerful than the European Union's Commission right now. The central government represented states, not citizens, and was dependent on state assent for its functions. In many ways, Congress, in its relations to states, was like the British King in its relations to Parliament. The power of the purse, that means the power of taxation, resided with the states. There was no army to speak of, there was a very small navy, and there was no central banking or central commerce department. Pretty much for the rest of the world, the Articles of Confederation and the Congress simply did not exist. But the problem for the states was that none of them were powerful enough or strong enough or large enough to be able to stand independently in international realm, in which Britain still controlled Canada and was the greatest naval power in the world, and the Spanish Empire was still very strong and situated to the south. So very quickly, men in the colonial elites became unhappy with the inability of the Articles of Confederation to create a country that they believed could defend itself against potential external threats. But that was not the only problem. There were also internal threats that worried them. Domestically, the lack of a central government that could put limits on what states could do, together with the newfound civic agitation of the people who fought for the revolution and had become indebted to the local elites, financially indebted, led to state legislators dominated by the majority of the citizens who were essentially poor and in debt to challenge private property in the form of debts and land. Radical redistribution and debt forgiveness made the revolutionary elites tremble. In many ways, the final scenes of the movie Revolution present an image of how those elites might have seen the exercise of newfound freedom by their less affluent fellow citizens. Quality of law was replaced by equality of outcome. And for the elites, that was as dangerous as the British interference in colonial economic and political affairs. In a very real way, also, these policies backfired for the poor. Sure, they were free of debts and now had property, but they could not find credit to buy the tools needed to cultivate that property. And there were no guarantees a future majority would not see them as the fat cats, in quotation marks. Foreign states and crucially British investors were loath to spend money in a country where a temporary majority could simply confiscate that money or forgive debts. So there was very real agitation for change across society through the various groups asking for change disagreed on what exactly they wanted.
Boats and Providence, 1776. Oh, you've had this a long time, haven't you? Right, 10, 20, 30, 40, that's it. Coming next? Is that it?
Wait, where's the rest?
What rest, mister?
$70.
They've been devalued. That's all them old Continentals is worth now. You take it or leave it. Hey, move along, you're holding up the queue.
Don't be pushing me.
I'm not pushing, I'm very busy now.
You,
come on.
What happened to the 150 acres?
What you complaining about,
I'm
mister?
not complaining, I'm asking a question. What happened to the 150 acres I was promised?
Listen, you got 2 arms and 2 legs and 2 eyes, haven't you? Now move on, I'm very busy. Right.
I told you, keep your hands off me.
You're holding up the line, mister.
I'm asking you a question.
You're holding up the line.
I'm asking you a question. What happened to the 150 acres of land I was promised?
It was sold by Congress to speculators to pay for the war debt. All right? Now move it.
I'm the bloody war debt.
Are you?
Yeah, this chit here. That's a bloody war debt. We all a bloody war debt.
So why don't you go to Congress? Don't tell me. You go to Congress, all of you, and you tell them.
No, I'll tell you,
Come on,
because you're
next.
standing here.
I'm not interested in talking to you. Come on, next.
Where's this Congress you're talking about?
Congress is coming here.
Where?
You go and tell them.
Where are they coming?
They're on their way.
When?
They're coming, damn you. I told you they're coming.
Damn you.
Go on, get out.
All these men here, we all fought for something, and we got it.
Yeah. Well, you think I didn't fight?
You take it from us, and we're going to fight again.
I'm taking nothing from you. You open your mouth to Congress.
The agitation for change led to the calling of another convention, the Constitutional Convention. Initially, it was only called to amend the Articles of Confederation so as to make the new country a place worth investing in for especially foreign investors. But it became quickly evident that many of the delegates were quite unhappy with the whole system of government and wanted changes. For many of the delegates representing states where the radicals had power, this was tantamount to treason. But the call for change was very real, and the radicals didn't feel they had the military might to impose their will or to risk a civil war. Although both sides were scared of things like a potential African-American slave revolt, they were afraid of things like a potential indigenous American or Native American revolutionary activity, and they were also afraid of Spain and Britain returning. So in the end, two factions arose that tried to essentially negotiate and create an agreement that everybody could agree on so the country wouldn't collapse. One faction represented the demand for change, and we have called it as the Federalists, while the other faction resisted that change, generally representing the more radical majoritarian legislators, and we call them the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists tended to represent the cream of American society. They were rich, powerful, educated white men. They believed that the current system of government will doom the American colonies to disunion, civil war, economic destitution, and ultimately conquest by foreign powers. To avoid these things, people like James Madison, which already met with his dislike of what he calls Bob Rule, and Alexander Hamilton, as well as John J. Marshall, believed that a strong central government with the power to tax was needed. The new government should be sovereign, representing the country to the foreign powers, not the states, with resources and legitimacy existing independent of the states. More importantly, the new government should have the power to limit the ability of state-level majorities to do as they wished. Government, according to their view, should protect the people from their own vices. They feared that absent a strong central government that put limits on what state majorities could do, democracy, if unchecked, would lead to a perversion of participatory democracy, which will become mob rule. Such an extreme outcome is shown in this clip from the anime Kino's Journey. Now, this is an extreme depiction of the perils of majoritarian electoral democracy, where people get to vote about everything, including whether you live or die. For many of the Federalists, that was what would happen if the Articles of Confederation were not changed. And to be frank, if you don't put some kind of anti-majoritarian protections in such a participatory democracy, it is not completely unfair to think that it could be perverted like that. I mean, people will tell you you can trust the people, but as Alexander Hamilton said, if people were angels, we wouldn't need government. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, people like Patrick Henry, Robert Yates, or George Mason, again, elites, just like the Federalists, saw themselves as the defenders of the rights of the common man. They believed that a central government would be a threat to individual liberty. By necessity, such a national government will be insulated from the demands and needs of the people living in the various states. It will be absurd to accept such a government to take into consideration the differences of life from state to state when promulgating national policy. For the Anti-Federalists, the crux was who exactly was this national policy going to represent. Government for them was a vice that should be kept as much small as possible and as local as possible. You can get a good idea of the issues by watching this debate between the actors playing Hamilton and Jefferson in the HBO series John Adams. Now, the scene takes place after the Constitution was adopted during President Washington's term, but the issues are very much the same. Now, Jefferson was not present at the Constitutional Convention because he was acting as ambassador of the United States of America to the French court, and he was caught in the middle of the French Revolution. Again, Jefferson's point kind of followed the ideas of the Anti-Federalists, while Hamilton is his usual Federalist self. There was a lot of question about who would hold power in this national government, because the states and colonies were very different. And these differences created points of contention.
I abhor them. But I've been as you know, in revolutionary France, where the streets are filled with the songs of liberty and brotherhood and the overthrow of ancient tyrannies of Europe, and to return from there to this, our cradle of revolution, and find the dinner table chatter is all of money and banks and authority is an unwelcome surprise.
Unwelcome, perhaps, but necessary.
I must admit, Mr. Hamilton, I'm a little uncertain as to the purpose of the Treasury Department. No doubt its function will reveal itself to me in good time.
The future prosperity of this nation rests chiefly in trade.
Trade depends, among other things, on the willingness of other nations to lend us money.
And how would you propose to establish international credit?
Our first step would be to incur a national debt. The greater the debt, the greater the credit. And to that end, I have recommended to the President that Congress adopt all the debts incurred by the individual states during the war through a national bank. The idea being that if the states owe Congress money, then other nations will feel more inclined to lend it to us.
If the states are indebted to a central authority, it increases the power of the central government.
You have it exactly. The greater the government's responsibility, the greater its authority.
The moneyed interest in this country is all in the north, so the wealth and power would inevitably be concentrated there in the federal government, to the expense of the south.
If that is the case, it is unavoidable if the Union is to be preserved.
I fear our revolution will have been in vain if a Virginia farmer is to be held in hock to a New York stock jobber, who in turn is in hock to a London banker. The opportunities for avarice and corruption would certainly prove irresistible.
Well, there you have it, as I have heard said. If men were angels, then no government would be necessary.
These two factions debated over the compromises made in the convention. How powerful the central government will be, how will it be run, how much should state populations count for determining influence on the promulgation of national policy. Two different plans were put forward: the Virginia plan that was in favor of slaveholding states, and the New Jersey plan that was in favor of smaller populated states. Why would a state like Vermont or Rhode Island stick to a system of government dominated by New York or Pennsylvania with their larger populations? How long will the government that ignored Virginia, New York, or Massachusetts survive? So, you have to find this very fine-tuned compromise between big and small states. Then you have the issue of slavery, the North versus the South in slavery. Should slaves count fully as part of the population, given the upper hand to the South, or should they count less, given the upper hand to the North? They solved that with a very despicable 3/5 compromise, where every enslaved person in the United States of America counted as 3/5 of a person when it came to questions of population for census purposes and for the purposes of distributing members of Congress to the various states. Then there was the issue of the abolition of slave trade. It was largely pushed by the North states in order to limit Southern population growth and increased influence. In the end, the South relented and accepted it, but it was postponed for a number of years until 1808, I think. We'll see that later in the Constitution. In the end, compromises were brought together, but to be frank, the Anti-Federalists still opposed the Constitution. So the new Constitution that was agreed by the Convention had to be ratified by the states and their populations. And we have to understand that they were trying to sold to a majority public a Constitution that would see their power restrained under it. So how did the Federalists did it? By promising security from factions, tyranny, and in the end compromising on some things. So they argued the larger states are more secure against factions, which by them meant essentially groups of people that were pursuing self-interest rather than public interest. You'll read some of the Federalist Papers to understand that. Then they argued that the issue of tyranny that the anti-federalists talked about could be resolved with the creation of checks and balances to protect from tyranny within the Constitution. And in the end, through gritted teeth, they had to essentially provide a Bill of Rights that protected the rights of citizens from the government. Initially, the Federalists did not want it because they thought the checks and balances in the Constitution are enough, but the anti-federalists were very adamant about it, and they used it as a way to get the anti-federalists to support the Constitution. So through a combination of these policies, they were able to push through the ratification of the Constitution, and the modern United States of America was created. The period from the end of the U.S. War of Independence to the ratification of the new Constitution saw a fertile growth in political debate. The citizens took advantage of clashing elites to make possible democratic compromises. Also, new ideas of citizenship and what it means to live in a democratic country came to the fore. The people now firmly believe that government should have the consent of the governed, that nobody should be granted any special privileges by the government, and that all citizens should enjoy equal rights. And they put all of those ideas in the new Constitution.